Hello, I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. Today actually is November 10th, and this has been a very anxious and difficult week after elections. It is sort of made me wonder, well, does it make sense even to do reviews of fountain pens? Doesn't it seem almost decadent to focus on such things? And but then I realized that actually it has been just an amazing solace for me to be able to journal and write and to draw, and that those are actually very important things precisely when the world is such an anxious place. So I will continue to do this. Last week I got in the mail that I'd ordered a new nib for me, a titanium Ultraflex nib from Osprey pens. Now that's a company that I actually have been very familiar with. Several years ago I got one of their pens. This is the Madison pen, very affordable, under $20, and I was trying out their Ultraflex steel nib, which I think was pretty good. I sort of like Fountain Pen Revolution's version of it better, but I also was intrigued by their kit that you could get where you could use a G nib, and I'll show you some of those today. But the titanium nib I think is really interesting, particularly since I just reviewed the Asfine J16 titanium pen. There are a lot of pens out there made out of titanium, but the nibs tend to be steel nibs. And titanium is an interesting material to make nibs out of. I've actually reviewed the Bach nib, titanium nib, on a Karas pen several months ago. And that was, I thought it was a nice nib. It works almost like a pencil, but it wasn't particularly a flex nib. This is a flex nib. I tried this out over a year ago at the Washington Pen Fair. They had some, Osprey was there, but I wasn't actually able to get one of the nibs, and they're kind of sold out. Anyway, I'm going to show you the nib and sort of go through some of the other choices that Osprey has, and then I did a drawing with the nib and compared it with their steel Ultraflex nib to see if it really makes a difference. As always, if this is useful, please do subscribe. So this is the Osprey Madison pen that I said that was under $20. I think you can get that with a kind of, simple nib choice, steel nib choice. You can see basically that this is actually it's a pen that looks a lot like the old Schaefer No Nonsense pen, and it goes all the way back, really, the design to the Parker Duo fold. It is translucent plastic resin, and it posts very well. It has this nice little wheel on the clip, which I think is a nice touch. Usually more expensive pens. I think their pens are made in India, but I'm not sure about that. They're actually, the company itself is in Texas, and they have these different choices of different nibs and the whole housing system that comes with a special converter and an ebonite, this is a key thing, an ebonite feed, because it's the ebonite feed that provides enough ink for the pen, the Flex pen. And the converter actually holds a little bit more ink than I think is usual in a usual converter, and it has a somewhat wider head to it. Anyway, so they sell this whole housing that fits into this pen, and you can get different versions depending on the different nibs. This one is the titanium nib, and you can see that it has what is a kind of falcon beak shape, which is also very similar to what the Fountain Pen Revolution's Flex Pen nib does. All right, so here is the titanium nib. And when you get this particular choice of pens, if you get the titanium nib, it comes with a clear section that attaches to the converter, and then you can put it into the Madison pen, and you can swap it with one that might hold a regular steel nib. You can also get this another option, which is a G nib. So a G nib is used by a lot of like comic book artists and normally would be used as a dip pen, but they've actually designed a housing that works so that you can use G nibs, and that's one possibility. If you like G nibs, eventually the ink will make the nib deteriorate. It will corrode the nib, but these nibs are very inexpensive, and you can get a bunch of them and switch them out. They don't have any tipping at all, so they're very scratchy, but they flex quite a lot, and that is something that Osprey offers. There are much more expensive pen companies that do the same thing, but this is really a very affordable option, and I think works fairly well. So you have the titanium, and then here is the regular steel. Their regular steel Ultra Flex. This is an extra 5, and you can see that it's the same shape. The nib is the same shape as the titanium. So basically, they're just doing it in a different material. There are many different issues when you're trying to create a flex nib. It's not just about making the line thinner and fatter. You also want to use a material that bounces back, so that when you move between the thin and thick, when you're pressing down, it bounces back to the thin again and has that kind of flexibility. That's why it's flexible, right? And that's why gold is used in nibs, because it gives it that both a certain strength and a softness and a flexibility. It's harder to do that with a steel nib. The hope here is that with titanium, which is a strong material and flexible and hopefully flexible material, that maybe you can achieve that but not have to spend as much money as you would if you're doing it out of 14 karat gold. That's the design hope. I also think, there's just something satisfying about the idea, and I would wish that some of these companies that are pushing titanium pens would think about making titanium nibs to go with their titanium pens. But be forewarned that when you're buying a pen from usually a Chinese company and it calls the pen the titanium, they're not talking about the nib. Anyway, the real question is, how does these pens perform in terms of how they write? I mean, the other thing is that I have noticed this is something in terms of the ink here, in this clear section, that you notice that the ink sort of just flows in and it almost is kind of leaking around the nib, around the section, and that's sort of odd, the way that kind of looks. This is black, but this is actually translucent, but the black ink has made it look as if it's almost black. And I have to say that's kind of surprised me in terms of how the pen is working and in terms of is it going to leak, etc. Because of that. I've seen a little bit of issues with that in terms of it leaking around here. So that's something to keep in mind. This is very much a first look at this nib and how it works, because I only got it this week, and I'm sort of giving you my reaction to it, and I'm gonna have to live with it for a while and maybe do another video and see how it stands up. So how does it write? Okay, so this is the Osprey Madison pen with a titanium Ultra Flex This is the extra fine. It comes in extra fine, extra fine, I think fine and medium. This is rhodia paper. Okay. And you can see that you can get quite a lot of line variation. The fine is not that super fine, but actually it works in reverse too, so that gives you a lot of variation. And if you put matter, kind of, it's almost like a semi-flex. It reminds me in some ways as the Pilot Falcon. And we're not getting, it's really going from like a fine to a broad. But it's, for this type of pen, it's pretty smooth. I am a terrible calligrapher. And you can see that if I write with it, I get a little bit of variation, the line, not a huge amount. Now, if this were a Waterman 52, when I would write with it just normally, there would be much more variation. So it really isn't like a old style flex nib. But it's pleasant to draw with, and the feed really does keep up with it. This is their regular sort of steel Ultraflex. And it is much sharper and doesn't have quite as much flex, and is less, I would say it's a much less pleasant experience to write with this. Now, it is considerably less money, but it has the same ebonite feed, and you can see that it also keeps up with the pen without any skipping, but this is much sharper, not nearly as nice to write with as the titanium. And then the final choice, I'm not going to try it out here, is they have a version that uses a G nib, which is titanium coated, and that has no tipping and is extremely sharp. So that's going to pick up some of the paper unless you're very careful with it, and that's a very different experience. But it has considerably more flex because it's really like a dip pen almost. And that's another kind of nib that will fit onto this pen. So when I was drawing with the pen, and doing these little trees and leaves and everything, I was impressed at how the nib and the ebonite feet kept up. It didn't skip a lot. I switched midway a little bit and used the regular steel nib to see if it made a difference. And definitely, I felt that the titanium nib drew better and was a little bit smoother and more pleasant experience. It didn't seem to make a huge amount of difference in terms of the actual flexing, how much flex you got out of it. And with both the titanium and the steel nib, if you don't put a lot of pressure on the pen, it just writes normally. It doesn't really have much flex. And that's not true of a true sort of vintage flex nib. A vintage flex nib, when you just write with it, has a sort of variation and has a lot more ability to sort of change and with it. Now, how this works as a calligraphy nib, that's something for somebody who does calligraphy. I don't do calligraphy, and so that would require a different review.